minimize the number of Palestinians in that state. And there are different ways that that can and was achieved and is still being worried about, and that's kind of a common theme throughout this whole narrative. But within the Zionist movement and within the leadership of the State of Israel now, there's a spectrum of opinions on how to do this. And just to simplify, there's the kind of the more moderate, pragmatic wing that is hesitant, a little bit more hesitant to offend world sensibilities, and seeks domination and seeks that goal of maximum land minimum Palestinians through more through compromise and accommodation. And then you have the more extremist wing who very openly want it all and act accordingly, act with even giving lip service to human rights, international law, United Nations, etc. It's that latter group that's really in charge of the Israeli government now, and it has at various times gone back and forth. And like I said, it's a spectrum. It's not two totally opposing camps, and they manage to accommodate with each other. They're not polar opposites. While sometimes one dominates, they accommodate. So in 1967 was a time of kind of sort of transition from one of these approaches to the other. Before 67, Israel was existing within those borders on the right. There was there was more and more clamor among some of the more militarists, some of the extremists, some religiously identified, just some very nationalist identified, that say, hey, we made a mistake of not going all the way and conquering the whole country in 1948, and we should find a way to do that. And just before the 1967 war, some of the main proponents of that attitude, namely Moshe Dayan, who was incorporated into the government as defense minister, and Menachem Begin was incorporated into the government as a minister without portfolio. So and they and some of the military people pushed. There were a number of very provocations that took place in the months before the war. A raid on a West Bank town in which several dozen Palestinians were killed and many wounded, and there was a number of provocations along the Syrian border, led to a famous air battle in which 7 Syrian fighter jets were shot down in April or May, shortly before the war of 1967. Those kinds of things increased the pressure on the leaders of Arab nationalism, primarily Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, to say, hey, what's going on here? Why aren't you standing up to these Israelis? They're threatening to pursue aggressive war. And this was within really relatively recent memory at that time, only 11 years earlier, 10 and a half years earlier, when Israel, in collusion with France and Britain, had in fact initiated a war and conquered all of Sinai. And the British and French, of course, were interested in getting control of the Suez Canal. And due to American pressure, because the United States was not allied with Israel then in the way it is now, Israel was forced to withdraw. And so on the Israeli side, that was considered kind of an embarrassment, a little bit of a shame. We put in this great effort, conquered this territory, and then had to give it all up. So this was the background of the 1967 war. A little bit jumping ahead to some of the outcomes of what was different between 67 and 48. There was, as you heard from Basma, a large majority of the Palestinian population in what became Israel lost their homes and were expelled and became refugees, with a certain number of them becoming what we call the internal or present refugees. And 150,000 remained in, some of them were refugees within the country, others were lucky enough to remain in their towns and villages. In 67, I think that the Israelis realized that they couldn't get away with that mass expulsion to that degree. Nevertheless, something that's unknown and not covered very much in the reports about the war, there were at least 250,000 Palestinians living in the West Bank who were in fact expelled from the country, sent across the bridges to Jordan for the most part during and immediately after the 1967 war. Several villages were totally empty, so there was a certain amount of similarity. even though it was harder to get away with the mass expulsions of '48. Since then, it was around 250, 300,000 out of a West Bank population of something around 800,000, I think, at the time. So it was a significant portion of the population, close to 40%. And what's also similar is that, as you probably know, the West Bank and Gaza up until 2005 were under total military rule. The residents were not given citizenship. Israel directly controlled it, and there are lots of implications and stories about what that means. But that was also not all that different from a model that had been set in the previous period. Even though Palestinians in Israel were given citizenship in 1950, they lived under a military regime which imposed considerable restrictions on their ability to travel, to move, to develop economically. So there was a model that already existed, and it was just applied on steroids after 1967 in the West Bank and Gaza and in other areas. Ultimately, the level of violence, though it has fluctuated, has generally been in an upswing under the occupation, and many more Palestinians have been killed, wounded, displaced along the way, not only right in 1967. Just to throw out one number, since 2000, this is a number I found from Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, there have been around 1,100 Israelis who have been killed in violence and in unrest just since 2000. The vast majority of those in a couple of years at the beginning of the Second Intifada, 2000, 2001, 2002. But at that same time, close to 11,000 Palestinians were killed. And that's more of a steady stream, except with the exceptions of the big numbers in Gaza during the major invasions in 2008, 2009, 2012, and again in 2014. But there's been steadily throughout the West Bank also violent clashes, generally initiated by the military patrols that come into the villages, and a regular killing and wounding of Palestinians, far more than the number of Israelis who have been Israeli casualties. And this is true even in the latest round of violence that began like around 2 years ago, so-called Knives Intifada, where a lot of Palestinian individuals, seemingly without any organizational direction, would attack mostly soldiers, sometimes civilians, or they were claimed to have attacked. And in that process, several hundred Palestinians have been killed, and it's the low double figures of Israelis. The number of arrests, an estimated 40% of the male population of the West Bank, which is now around 2 million, close to 2.5 million, I think, total population. About 40% of the male population, and some women, of course, but many fewer, have been incarcerated at some point in the course of the 50 years of occupation. 5 minutes, I'm barely starting. We'll get to it. So what has been in common throughout is the dominant ideology within Israeli Jewish society that what we're building here is a state that is for Jews, and Palestinians are really not wanted. If we could get rid of them one way or another, that would be great. And there are various proposals on how to do that, ranging from mass expulsion to perhaps redefining parts of what's now Israel to become part of a Palestinian state. That's a favorite proposal of Foreign Minister Leibovich. But the occupation, which has become increasingly violent and increasingly repressive as time goes on, I would argue is now reverberating in a way of kind of chickens coming home to roost in Israel itself, where there have been a number of laws passed recently that are attacks on democracy, on free speech, on freedom of the press. There's the most recent legislative attempt is to put the old British emergency regulations, which are the basis for a lot of the repressive control in the occupied territories, to ensconce them in regular law, in Israeli law, so they can be applied more regularly. The right to revoke citizenship of people who oppose the state, limiting due process for those who identify with the enemy, bans of family reunification, crackdowns on human rights organizations, on attacking their funding, attacking their ability to operate, intense demolitions and banishment, particularly in the south of the country, of Bedouins within Israel. That's been going on for the last few years. And perhaps most of all, a pending law that's been going back and forth in arguments for the last couple of years, called the Jewish Nation State Law, which would, if it's passed in some form or another, would pretty much all but abandon this definition of the state from its beginning as being Jewish and democratic. And whether or not that's possible is debatable. It's certainly very, very difficult. But the new proposed law would enshrine the symbols and the ideology, would require that the judicial system work on the basis of Jewish law to a large extent. And despite all this, Palestinians in Israel, and to a large degree within the occupied territories as well, are very doggedly persisting in pursuing education, working hard, becoming professionals, and even going into business, and under such conditions that's an admirable thing to make note of. So I'm going to go with one more quick section. I forgot to show these. Okay, this shows the territories that were occupied in 1967. Okay, a little bit of quick myth busting regarding the war itself. I already mentioned some of the background of the things that happened in the months before, but this is the conventional wisdom. This is the Prime Minister of Israel speaking the day after the war ended. And this is still what is really the conventional wisdom if you read mainstream media reports and even books about what happened today. There's lots of angst. And I watched an interesting film last night called Censored Voices, which I recommend, which really shows that Israeli Jews really thought this and really believed it, and there was incredible angst. They were led to believe it by the government. On the other hand, within a couple years after the war, you see major leaders of Israel saying, well, no, it really wasn't true. The Egyptians didn't really mean to start a war. They couldn't have done it, and if they had, we would have beaten them anyway. We had a Menachem Begin. This was a little bit later, but he also, his right wing bottom line isn't showing. We had a choice. The Egyptian army did not, concentrations did not prove that Nasser was really about to attack. We must be honest with ourselves. We decided to attack him. That's what it says on the bottom. At first, when the war broke out, the Israeli propaganda machine issued announcements saying that the Egyptians had attacked us. That was immediately dispelled. It was an obvious lie. But then the conventional wisdom became that it was a preemptive attack. That they were about to attack us, and they would have wiped us out. We were in danger of being wiped out. Of course, the basic international law provision that says a preemptive attack is illegal, just like any other. Nothing in the UN Charter, the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense. If an armed attack occurs, that's the only exception to the right of an individual, the bar an individual state from initiating use of force of arms. Anyway, okay. Once we are ahead of schedule, so I'm going to go one more minute if I can. Okay. Once the Israeli planes attacked with this surprise attack, the war was pretty much over really within hours. But I think historians agree that it lasted longer. 6 days doesn't sound like a long time, but compared to a few hours it is. And it lasted longer because Israel had made the decision that it really wanted to conquer the West Bank and the Golan Heights as well as the initial. And it took a few days for it to move its troops into that. Another thing that I saw in that film, that there was some serious fighting both in the West Bank and in the Syrian Golan. It wasn't just simply cakewalk. And about 1,000 Israeli soldiers were killed out of 17,000 in the whole war. The largest number were Egyptians. So, given what became of this occupation and the mess we're in now and the violence and the fact that it seems like it seems so impossible to solve, was this a reckless decision on the part of the Israelis to do this? Probably in a way, because it's not really hard to predict that this would have led to such intensified permanent conflict. But the hawks who took control at that time figured that they would get their way. And I think that they also strategized that they were going to use this to build an alliance with the United States, which didn't exist at the time. And just to demonstrate this, there was this famous incident of a ship, U.S. ship that was a intelligence ship that was intercepting signals and sitting off the coast of northern Sinai, the USS Liberty, which the Israelis attacked. Both sides' official versions say that it was an accident, and there was apologies, and there was compensation, but there's a lot of skepticism among historians, though it is apparently true that there was an order sent from the Sixth Fleet that the ship should move farther away, and it either ignored or missed that order. There's lots of implausible conspiracy theories false flag speculations that I'm not going to go into, but I think the one that is plausible given the circumstances is that Israel saw that realized the United States was intercepting its communications, was afraid that the Soviet Union, which was aligned with Egypt and Syria at the time, was intercepting the American communications, and didn't want any of those powers to know exactly what it was doing in terms of moving troops and continuing the war for several more days to conquer the West Bank and the Golan Heights. And why? So this is also a demonstration of the fact that the United States was officially neutral in the '67 war. It was not aligned, it was not providing major arms to Israel at the time, but as we all know, it became much more so afterwards. Pan-Arab nationalism and Nasser were discredited by the war, and it ushered the war of '67 ushered in not only the U.S.-Israel alliance, but U.S. domination really of the whole region, and that is arguably something that was perhaps another Israeli goal in both attacking the ship and in pursuing the war in the first place. And Israel has become not only a recipient of massive U.S. aid, that just kind of shows the amount relative to other countries in the area, but also has been a surrogate throughout the Cold War, and now in the so-called War on Terror, has become a surrogate in supplying weapons training and other equipment to countries that the United States wants to support, but prefer having somebody else do the dirty work. That's been going on now for decades, and it has developed to such a large degree that it's now a huge business both for the Israeli government and for Israeli private firms. They're opportunistically supplying weapons to some of the worst regimes in the world. Recently it's come out they've been selling weapons to Myanmar, to South Sudan, where major genocides are taking place. So we'll stop there. More that hope to get to about the characteristics of the occupation, but we'll.
Thank you, David. Yes, there's much to be said. So comments, questions from other panelists? Well, I would like to introduce Professor Omar Dajani of the McGeorge School of Law, a co-director of the Law School's Global Center for Business and Development. Professor Dajani is recognized as a leading expert on legal aspects of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. He began his legal career by clerking for Judge Dorothy W. Nelson at the United States Court of Appeal in the Ninth Circuit, and working as a litigation associate at the Washington, D.C. office of Sidley and Austin. In 1999, Professor Dajani was recruited to serve as a legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team in peace talks with Israel, ultimately participating in the summits at Camp David and Tauba. He then joined the Office of the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, UNESCO, where he works on where he worked on peace-building initiatives and played a lead role in marshaling and organizing international efforts to support Palestinian legal and political reform. Professor Tajani has continued since that time to work as a consultant on a variety of legal infrastructure developments and conflict resolution projects in the Middle East and elsewhere for institutions including the U.S. Department of State, the Norwegian Peacebuilding Resource Center, and the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue.
Thanks very much, and thanks once again to all of you for joining us today. Incidentally, it's not too lacking in dignity. There is room on the floor for those of you who are standing up front. Please don't hesitate to come and sit. It gives you a rest. Our aim for the conversation today was to mark a number of milestones. The centenary of the Balfour Declaration, 50 years of military occupation, 70 years since the first two-state solution plan had been proposed, and also, coming to me, 10 years of blockade against the Gaza Strip. And what I'd like to do today, at least during this first part of our conversation about the Gaza Strip, is to focus on a few specific questions. How the Gaza Strip came to be, and came to be one of the most densely populated places on Earth. Secondly, what kinds of restrictions are in place on the movement of goods and persons to and from the Gaza Strip. Third, the extent to which the Gaza Strip remains under military occupation by Israel, and as a consequence, the extent to which Israel continues to owe certain legal obligations to the population of the Gaza Strip. And then finally, and briefly, the question, who cares and why? Why it is important for us to look at what's going on in the Gaza Strip at present, what implications it has when we think about the future. But let me just try to situate the Gaza Strip for you a little bit. You see a map of it up here on the screen, and its current population, as of estimates from this summer, is just under 1.8 million people. Now, that 1.8 million reside in a territory that is about 360 square kilometers. And you can see up here on the screen what the scale of it is compared to our own beloved Sacramento area. To go from one end of the Gaza Strip to another, which is pretty much the entire scope of movement allowed to most Gazans over the last decade, is a little less intensive than going from just below Elk Grove up to Roseville. We're not talking about a very substantial amount of space, and that is, of course, true with respect to Israel and Palestine as a general matter. Location, 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 where there's